Okay. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. This is meeting number 44 of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, Wednesday, December 1st, 2010. Today we are continuing our study on issues surrounding security at the G8 and G20 summits. Towards the end of our meeting today, approximately 5:15, our committee will go to committee business, if that's still the wish. It was at the end of last meeting, so our intentions are that we would go to committee business at 5:15 today. Appearing as witnesses with us, we have from the University of Toronto, Munk School of Global Affairs, Jenny Giebert, Director of Research on the G8 and G20 groups. From the Movement Defence Committee of the Law Union of Ontario, Mike Leotold, member. Also from the Department of National Defence, General John Collin, Chief of Staff of the Canada Command, and from the Peel Regional Police Superintendent, Brian Adams. I understand that each one of you have an opening statement for our committee today. Hopefully we can hold those statements to approximately 10 minutes each, and then we would proceed into the first and subsequently the second round of questioning. The first round of questioning will be 7-minute rounds for each party, and we would look forward to your statements. And looking across this panel, perhaps Ms. Giebert, if you would begin, we would appreciate that.
Thank you. I will try and keep it to 10 minutes because I know there's probably a lot of questions, comments perhaps that need to be made. Before starting with my official presentation, I just want to give a brief context what I'm going to present. So I am the Director of Research at the G8 and G20 research groups at the Munk School. And our group's mission is to serve as the world's leading independent source of information, analysis, and research of the institutions, issues, and members of the G8 and the G20 summits, respectively, within both groups. In this capacity, I research trends related to both groups, both in terms of policy and in terms of the physical summits themselves. I have been on site at several G8 and G20 summits, as well as other ministerial meetings, and I generally attend these meetings as part of the accredited media, where our groups conduct on-site analysis and interviews. Today I'm here to discuss issues surrounding security of the G8 and the G20 summits that were hosted in June. I am simply going to try and provide you with facts and evidence that the G8 and G20 research groups have gathered on this topic from past summits, as well as provide you with any insight and thoughts that I have from my personal experiences at these past summits. I have no expertise in regards to policing or proper security protocol. I can offer examples of problematic cases that have come up at other summits, or give you an idea of some of the security measures that have been enforced at other summits, but I have little knowledge to offer in regards to what instruments should or should not be used, how many personnel should or should not be required at each summit, or what is unlawful or inappropriate. It is extremely difficult to predict what sort of events will transpire at a G8 or G20 summit. Protesting can be expected now, but how violent, in what numbers, where they will gather, and what instruments they will use is impossible to know. There is also now a common fear of potential terrorist attacks that might take place at these summits. It is also difficult to come up with a single figure for how much a G8 or G20 summit will cost, including for security, particularly on a country comparative basis, since there are many variables to take into consideration. When assessing overall summit costs, one needs to assess factors including already available facilities at the summit sites, regular and overtime salaries, accommodations, travel expenses, meals, security, technology, infrastructure, communication, and service staff. There are also differences in when and how hosts report these costs, what they include as a special summit expense rather than part of their regular operation or capital budgets, how much of the pre-summit preparatory and post-summit implementation period they include in these reports, the timing of their fiscal years, and exchange rates at the time of financial reporting and subsequently as most costs become known. Some hosts benefit from the use of large military and security facilities that are already in place, as was the case at the recent summit that I attended in Seoul, or they'll use the summit as a trigger for major capital investment in a particular region. This was the case, for example, at the 2000 Okinawa summit in Japan. In the lead-up to the summits this summer, it was estimated that the Canadian government was going to spend $1.1 billion on the events, including $930 million for security. This number has come down a bit since then. The last report I saw was around $858 million. Lower than the predicted costs, but still one of the highest in summit history, at least from the available evidence that we have gathered. The G20 summit was actually the most expensive in terms of the costs for Toronto. However, when we look at the cost for the Muskoka summit, it was actually fourth. The 2000 summit, the 2008 summits that were both hosted by the Japanese came in as first and second, and the Russian summit in 2006 was actually the third most expensive. It is not uncommon that the majority of the money for G8 and G20 summits is spent on security. This is in line with the majority of past summits. What did stand out for the Canadian summits was the overall dollar figure that was actually spent. For example, British estimates from the 2005 summit in Gleneagles suggest that it cost £90.9 million, approximately $157 million US, the majority of which went to policing and security. The London G20 summit was reported to have cost approximately $30 million. It is estimated that the 2002 Kananaskis summit cost around $200 to $300 million. Again, most money went to security. This was the first summit that was to take place after September 11th, as well as the G8 summit in Genoa 2001, where there were massive protests and the first civilian actually died on the sidelines of a G8 event. I would also like to point out that it is not uncommon for Canada to spend more on security than other countries at summits, just because we don't have massive infrastructures in place for security, such as large military contingents, such as what was the case at the Seoul summit in November. The high costs for the G8 and the G20 summits this summer were not unprecedented. The 2000 Okinawa summit is reported to have been the most costly. Media reports claimed that this summit cost between $750 and $780 million. While this is less than the $858 million reported for the Canadian meetings, it was only for one meeting, a G8 one. The Japanese government intentionally selected Okinawa as the G8 summit location to usher money into this area. There has also been much discussion over damage, security protocol, and the degree of force used by officers on duty at the G8 and the G20 summits. These challenges do not always accompany summits. For instance, at the first G20 summit in Washington in 2008, there was very little in terms of this to report. However, on the whole, this is not uncommon. For example, at the 2001 Genoa summit, arguably the most violent of all the summits, an estimated 200,000 demonstrators showed up, hundreds of people were injured, and one man was shot dead by an Italian officer. The officer was acquitted from any charges as a judge determined he was acting in self-defense. After the G20 finance ministers meeting in Australia in 2006, 26 people were charged and arrested for reasons including damaging property, arson, and disorderly conduct. At the G20 summit in London in April 2009, 86 protesters were arrested, and just a few days ago it was reported that the UK police officer who attacked Ian Tomlinson at the London summit will in fact be charged for inadvertently causing or contributing to his death at a gross misconduct hearing. The officer is in fact being charged for using force that is considered not necessary, proportionate, or reasonable in these circumstances. I have a variety of other facts and information available from summits past, as well as the Canadian summits, that I'd be happy to share, and I look forward to your questions or comments later.
Thank you very much, Ms. Giebert, all in 7 minutes and 30 seconds. We appreciate that. I'll just warn our committee members as well as our guests that there is a chance that the bells may start ringing fairly soon. If that happens, we will have to suspend and then go to the House for a vote. But our intentions are that we're going to come back here and continue with this. So, do just if that happens, if you see lights flashing and bells ringing, not to fear. We'll now proceed to General Collins, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to explain the role and actions of the Canadian Forces during the G8 and G20 summits, and also to address any questions or concerns that committee members may have. I'm here today in two capacities. First, I am currently the Chief of Staff of Canada Command, the organization that is responsible for all routine and contingency domestic operations, less air defense, which remains a NORAD responsibility. Second, and perhaps equally important, in my previous job, I was the Canadian Forces Joint Task Force Commander for the G8 and G20 summits, and as such, was responsible for all the tactical planning and execution of the military operations associated with the summits. Dans ce bref préambule, je voudrais simplement...
In these short opening remarks, I would like to offer a few main themes and also describe in broad terms the primary functions undertaken by the Canadian Forces during the summits.
It's important to remember that the Canadian Forces were in support of law enforcement agencies. We were not the lead. You are aware that the overall responsibility for summit security rested with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Working with them and other police forces of jurisdiction, the Canadian Forces developed plans and executed operations as part of the larger team, but always in support of requirements and requests from our law enforcement partners. Specifically, the Canadian Forces provided, either directly or indirectly, support to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Ontario Provincial Police, Toronto Police Services, and Peel Regional Police. Throughout, and consistent with normal practice and government policy, the Canadian Forces focused on providing capabilities that are unique to the military or capabilities that were clearly beyond the capacity of the first responders. Our main roles can be summarized in four broad areas. Premièrement, les forces canadiennes.
First, the Canadian Forces, working within the binational command known as NORAD, were responsible for air defense. This is a standing task for Canada's military, which is executed 365 days a year. For the summits, there were increased demands in the form of restricted flight zones and increased forces required to satisfy the demands of potential threats. But, essentially, the task was one which our military executes on a regular and continuous basis.
Contributed significantly to surveillance and early warning. We did this with ground, air, and to a limited degree, naval resources. Our main task was to ensure that all potential hazards and threats were identified and communicated quickly and accurately to the decision makers for action. The Canadian Forces also provided military air transport, both fixed-wing airplanes and rotary-wing helicopters, in support of the summits. Tasks included the transportation of the heads of states and other VIPs to and from the G8 summit location, and administrative transport of some police forces to alternate locations. We were also prepared to execute other tasks, such as emergency air evacuation of the heads of state, rapid delivery of police emergency response teams, and emergency medical evacuation. In the end, none of these tasks were required. Et finalement, les forces canadiennes.
Finally, the Canadian Forces provided assistance in establishing and then operating the command and control architecture for the summits. To be clear, we did not lead this effort, nor were we the only agency to contribute to it. But our past experiences and our integral capabilities were used to enhance the capabilities at various command nodes, most notably at the RCMP-led Integrated Security Unit and the Unified Command Centre at Barrie, Ontario.
It is important to also remember that the Canadian Forces were neither asked, nor would we have entertained the request, even if asked, to conduct crowd control operations, or what police forces call public order duties. Maintaining public order is clearly a police responsibility, and the Canadian Forces are neither trained nor equipped to fulfill that role. For that matter, we also did not undertake any of what might be termed traditional police functions, such as arrest and evidence gathering. These limitations on the use of Canadian Forces personnel were clearly understood by all of our security partners and led to no difficulties whatsoever in our ability to support the police in the 4 broad areas that I have just outlined. Pour assurer ce soutien, les forces canadiennes ont fourni.
To accomplish this support, the Canadian Forces contributed approximately 3,000 personnel dispersed primarily in and around Huntsville, the Lester B. Pearson Airport in Toronto, the Toronto waterfront, at various command and control nodes, and in the skies overhead. The majority of the elements were deployed for no more than 25 to 30 days, and this included all their movement and training requirements. And many of the deployments were for much shorter periods.
Was approximately $77 million, of which, although the final figures have yet to be tallied, we expect to expend only approximately $20 million, or 26% of that budget. The significant reduction can be attributed to several cost-saving measures that were implemented, and the fact that since everything went according to plan, contingency funds, which were approximately $20 million, did not need to be used. Overall, from a CF perspective, the planning and execution of the summits were resounding successes. I was quite pleased with the leadership and competencies demonstrated by our police partners, and together we formed an outstanding team. As the Canadian Forces Joint Task Force Commander, I must close by stating how impressed I was with the professionalism and accomplishments of all CF personnel associated with the summits. I know I also speak for the entire senior leadership of the Canadian Forces when I state that we would have it no other way, and that our men and women in uniform continue to do us proud. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, General Collin. We'll go to Mr. Adams, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Peel Regional Police, my Chiefs Management Group, and myself, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to address this committee in regards to the roles and responsibilities of Peel Regional Police during the G8, G20 summits. I was the designated command lead for Peel Regional Police. I was responsible for the overall operation. During the summits itself, I was the assigned incident commander for Peel Police at the Unified Command Center in Barrie. I'd like to, before I begin, to give you an introduction in regards to Peel Regional Police. The Peel Regional Police, being the second largest municipal police organization in the province of Ontario, provides policing services to 1.2 million residents of the cities of Brampton and Mississauga. There are 1,891 uniformed personnel and 764 civilian staff within our organization. Police services are made available through 5 divisional facilities, 11 community stations, the MLV Cove facility, and police headquarters. The service delivery area is 538 square kilometers. The City of Toronto is on our eastern border, and the regional municipality of Halton is located on our western boundary. The region of Peel borders Lake Ontario, and our marine units patrols all accessible shoreline, including inland bodies of water and 272 square kilometers of water to the international border with the United States. Canada's busiest airport, Lester B. Pearson International Airport, is situated in the city of Mississauga and is policed by Peel Regional Police under a full cost recovery agreement with the Greater Toronto Airports Authority. An estimated 32 million passengers pass through the airport annually. The mandate of the Peel Regional Police is to maintain peace and good order, protect lives and property, investigate and resolve criminal activity, prevent crime, and respond to our community's needs. Balanced by sensitivity to the importance of successful major crime resolutions, the organization is committed to community-based policing, the development and effective proactive initiatives, crime prevention programs, and victim services as delineated by the Ontario Police Services Act. Peel Regional Police G8, G20 Summit involvement. In July of 2009, the Peel Regional Police were invited to partake in meetings with the Integrated Security Unit in preparation for the G8 Summit. I apologize, I think I'm getting a little old. It was believed that the Lester B. Pearson International Airport was being considered as a possible arrival point for dignitaries and their families. The degree of involvement for our organization in the summit was unknown at that time. When the announcement was made in September of 2009 that Canada would be also hosting the G20, it was anticipated that the Lester B. Pearson International Airport would play an integral role in the movement of those heads of state who were considered to be internationally protected persons. This would necessitate the involvement of the Peel Regional Police in the protection of these individuals. It was at this stage of the process that the Peel Regional Police selected a lead planner and a small dedicated group to begin preparing preliminary operational plans for the summits. The responsibilities of the planning team included airport security, motorcade security, accreditation and security checkpoints, as well as maintaining ongoing airport division operations. As a member of the Integrated Security Unit, Peel Regional Police ensured that in coordinating and developing the security plans that they fully integrated with our policing partners. In December of 2009, it was announced that Toronto was to host the G20 and that Lester B. Pearson International Airport was to become the main port of entry for several heads of states and their delegations. As a result of this announcement, Peel Regional Police had to increase its initial GA planning team to support the additional functions and scope of the G20 summit. This process involved the following list of activities or tasks: development of integrated operational security plans, implementation of a community relations group to engage with citizens, area businesses, and the community impacted by the summits, gather intelligence and conduct investigations, development of logistical plans, development of financial plans associated with the overall security of the operation, and procurement of supplies and equipment, as well as the identification and implementation of infrastructure upgrades. All areas within our organization participating in the preparing of the operational plans for the G8 G20. These areas included tactical and rescue, explosive disposal unit, canine, criminal investigations, forensic identification, traffic services, bicycle units, intelligence, fleet management, telecommunications systems and services, information technology services, uniform patrol, and I'll add to the list that I initially provided: communications, finance and administration, and public affairs. It is important to identify that the Peel Regional Police form strong partnerships with the Greater Toronto Airports Authority and the emergency management teams from the region of Peel, the cities of Mississauga and Brampton, as well as our partners from Fire and EMS. Their contributions were essential in the overall development of our plans. The Peel Regional Police were fully committed to the RCMP-led integrated security team. There were over 30 committees and working groups that we were involved in. We participated in all of the mandated exercises which we conducted in preparation for these summits. Training programs provided for our officers at all levels in preparation for the summits, which include the Incident Management System, Incident Command, and CBRNE training. The mobilization process for Peel Regional Police effectively began on Monday, June 21st, 2010, and concluded on Monday, June 28th, 2010. All regular days off and vacation time was canceled during this time period. Peel Regional Police personnel were phased in during the week of mobilization. During the peak times during the summits, approximately 650 personnel were used daily. Peel Regional Police had executive representation on the steering committee and assigned incident commanders to the Unified Command Center in Barrie and the Toronto Area Command Center at Lester B. Pearson International Airport. We did not have representation in the other command areas for the summits. Peel Regional Police also provided assistance to our policing partners in Toronto. A memorandum of understanding was prepared for 10 motorcycle officers, 4 marine officers, and 2 video producers to provide assistance during the week of the summits itself. On Friday, June 25, 2010, the Toronto Police Service made a request to have the Peel Regional Police Public Safety Unit attend the City of Toronto for support. The request was approved, and 81 Peel Regional Police officers were subsequently assigned to Toronto. The Public Safety Unit has 2 commanders and supervisory staff within its structure. They worked in Toronto under the direction of the Toronto Police Service until released on Monday, June 28, 2010. On Saturday, June 26, 2010, the Peel Regional Police received a request from our integrated security partners for additional uniform resources to be assigned to the City of Toronto. The Peel Regional Police provided an incident commander and supervisory staff, as well as 128 uniform officers to the Toronto Police Service for June 27, 2010. Again, these officers were subject to the command and direction of the Toronto Police Service. We would like to recognize the commitment and professionalism of our partners within the Integrated Security Unit. The combined efforts and extensive planning of our partners was exceptional. In closing, the G8 and G20 summits was the largest security undertaking in the history of the Peel Regional Police. The safe and efficient policing operations at the Lester B. Pearson International Airport were integral to the success of the G8T20 summit. We are extremely proud that we were able to ensure the safety and security of the general public and heads of state during the summits. This is a tribute to the men and women within our organization. Once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adams. These bells are not going to be long bells, my understanding is. So we are going to suspend at this point, and we'll come back and with great expectation wait to hear what Mr. Leopold has for us. We'll just suspend. Mr. McKenzie.
I know that we had indicated that at 5:15 we go to committee business, but I think because of the vote and the delay, it would only be fair to the witnesses that we go to 5:30 so that these people who have taken time out of their lives to be here, that they get an opportunity to talk to the committee.
Is that all right? All right, do we have a consensus? See everybody nodding their heads? All right, that looks like we're going to be able to hear from you there, Mr. Leotold. All right, so then we will proceed and we'll go till 5:30, in which time we will adjourn. There will be other bells coming on. So welcome back, committee, and at the break, before we went to votes, we were just preparing to hear from Mr. Leotold. So Mr. Leotold, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here speaking today as a member of the Law Union of Ontario's Movement Defence Committee. I'm also a lawyer, but I'm today speaking as a member of that committee. And just by way of background, that's a working group of the Law Union of Ontario, and that working group focuses on providing legal support to progressive organizations and social justice activists in Toronto. Our role during the G20 protests, both before, during, and after, was threefold in essence. We provided some background Know Your Rights information and legal trainings to those who had expressed an intention of attending the demonstrations. And through our Summit Legal Support Project, we did those workshops around Southern Ontario. We also trained and fielded approximately 100 legal observers to monitor police action and misconduct. And those persons were easily identifiable wearing orange hats during the demonstrations. And we also created a legal office, a legal response office that would have been staffed for about a total of 12 days from June 18th to 30th with a legal number that people could call if they were experiencing police harassment or in a circumstance of being detained or arrested, or simply to report searches or other excesses by the police. And in some instances, we did receive calls about police brutality. We also, for people who had been arrested, we had created a list of lawyers who were prepared to offer their services pro bono to individuals who were arrested, and we did end up requiring the services of all 25 of the lawyers who had offered those services for free. We were, in many cases, the first non-police point of contact for the over 1,100 people arrested. We received hundreds of calls from the Prisoner Processing Centre, and we also supported those detainees and arrestees, connecting them with their parents, connecting them with possible sureties to bail them out, and also taking steps to ensure that dependents or pets or other things that needed to be dealt with while they were detained were dealt with, and also advocating on their behalf in order to obtain medication, assistive devices, or other supports. Now, our direct experience in that regard, I think, gives us a unique perspective on the events of the policing of the G20, and I think what our experience has led us to conclude is that there are many unanswered questions that arise out of these demonstrations and the policing of them, that we hope you will join us in our call for a public inquiry with subpoena powers in order to get to the bottom of those questions. Some have characterized, I think, the policing of the G20 summit, broadly speaking, as sort of a threefold process. One characterized by police restraint initially. Some have called police action negligent, and then leading to a police overreaction later on in the weekend. Our experience diverges from that criticism. In fact, we don't necessarily see the negligence or the overreaction part. We actually observed a systematic targeting of social justice movements in Canada over the period leading up to the G20 demonstrations and during them and after. And what amounts effectively to a systemic repression of critics and those who oppose the policies of this government. We point out in our written submission the differences in the policing of two major demonstrations that took place in Ontario this summer. The anti-choice demonstrations on May 13th, 2010 in Ottawa versus the G20 protests, which of course took place in the last week of June in 2010, this summer. One obviously didn't have a prison created for it or millions of dollars spent in preparation for the policing of it. and one did. And of course, it's the second, the latter, the G20 protests that we're here talking about today. There are 7 basic areas, and I'll go through them quickly, but there's 7 basic areas of police repression that we identified arising out of our committee's experience this summer. The first being searches, harassment, and detention of activists and protesters. Secondly, the militarization, and I'll repeat that, militarization of police tactics in operational functions. Thirdly, the use of preventative arrest and detention against protesters. Fourthly, violations of persons' procedural rights when in detention or arrested. Fifthly, we received considerable concern about the conditions in the prisoner processing center, and I'll spend a bit of time on that. Also, we noted mass violations of the Human Rights Code and the Canada Human Rights Act, which of course governs the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And finally, certain indicia of criminalization of dissent, which took place over the course of those demonstrations. I'll go through them briefly, if I might. With respect to police harassment, detention, and searches, we received reports leading up to the demonstrations of dozens of instances of police harassment of activists and organizers, leading to home visits, workplace visits, visits at schools, involving RCMP agents or operatives contacting people seen to be organizers of the demonstrations. We received reports of 29 incidents of that type of harassment. Between Monday the 21st of June and Saturday, June 26th, we received reports of over 80 people being harassed, detained, and searched by the police. We believe that many others were similarly harassed, detained, and searched, but may not have known that our services existed. Notable indicia of these types of harassment and search, it almost always involved pedestrians walking in downtown Toronto, generally young people, targeted by their appearance, conducted by police in our view without reasonable grounds, often involved groups of armed police officers surrounding those pedestrians, invariably included searches of people's bags and pockets without any caution that they weren't required to participate in that search, and often involved the illegal seizure of personal belongings, including leftist political literature. And I'll just note this is prior to the afternoon of Saturday, June 26th. On many instances, the police relied on the Public Works Protection Act, fictitious powers under that act, in order to justify their detention and search of those pedestrians. And in many cases, they also claimed expanded detention and search powers under the Trespass to Property Act. For example, on Friday, June 25th, persons entering Allen Gardens in Toronto were told they could not enter the park without having their bags searched, pursuant to the Trespass to Property Act. And further, the police often near the subway system would assert that the Trespass to Property Act allowed them to search people's persons and belongings. In our view, the above and what I've described shows a blatant pattern of bad faith searches on the part of the police and a pattern of proactive targeting of activists that began well in advance of Saturday, June 26th. And we've highlighted questions that need answers, such as what were frontline officers told and by whom of the legal limits of their powers to stop and search persons during that period of time, and what orders or directions were given with regard to police searches and investigative detentions, and who gave those orders. Turning to the second area of concern, that being the police militarization of operational tactics. Queen's Park on Saturday, June 26, 2010, many of our legal observers described a concerted effort by police that day to terrorize participants in a demonstration on the lawns of the legislature. Numerous horse charges were used, baton charges were used, corralling of protesters into small groups. Snatch squads would then proceed and target individuals. Tear gas and rubber bullets were used. And as I believe the Special Investigations Unit has at least concluded, excessive force in the use of by police with respect to physical assaults of individuals who are being arrested. These instances, I think, what we're asking is why were those militarized use of force tactics used against demonstrators at Queen's Park, and what orders were police forces given in relation to the gathering at Queen's Park? And this, of course, are the grounds of the legislature, which has been subject to much debate in the media and in the public. We'd also note that the legal observers that we had present did not hear any announcements by the police asking the crowd to disperse at that time. Thirdly, I'd point to the rampant and illegal use of what we describe as preventative arrest and detention. The Movement Defense Committee concluded that what we've concluded is that over 740 people, at least 740 people, were held under breach of the peace provisions of the criminal code. For those who don't know, that's not actually a criminal charge, and that section of the code requires that, in fact, people be released within 24 hours. And as a result of that large-scale detention of individuals, we would argue that the fact that they were held beyond those 24-hour limits, those breaches of police powers, we're concerned about who made those, who ordered those breaches, and were they done to prevent or undermine further demonstrations that weekend. Turning to the fourth area, the violations of procedural rights that I mentioned, many of the people who were held at the Prisoner Processing Centre were not told the reasons of their arrest. Those who spoke French weren't told in French. People weren't able to access counsel in a timely way. They weren't able to use the phone in a timely way. Many were held for 24 hours without seeing a justice of the peace, which is not justified in the Toronto region. There's no shortage of resources to bring people before the justice of the peace. And many who were released were subject to what we would characterize as unreasonable terms of release. I've cited some questions that need answers with respect to those violations, most notably who gave those orders, and were there really resource issues in respect to that, those undermining of those procedural rights. You've heard much about the conditions of the Prisoner Processing Centre. We've cited many of the accounts that we heard in the over 200 calls that we got from prisoners at that centre. Notably, many people had their photographs taken in illegal circumstances that weren't justified under the Identification of Criminals Act, i.e. they weren't charged with any offence. Many people were held without proper what might be called conditions. Lights were left on all night. No food or water was provided for 12 or more hours. People.
Can I ask you, we're over 12 minutes now.
I'll be very quick if I might, Mr. Chair. I just have two other areas that I'd like to highlight of concern, and then I'll
give you about 25 seconds.
Thanks very much.
We want to get to questions.
Absolutely. So mass violations of the Human Rights Code and the Canada Human Rights Act. People can go to our submissions in order to talk about the targeting, notably of many queer persons who are visibly queer, also those who are disabled, were not accommodated when they were detained. And with respect to the criminalization of dissent, many people were targeted, community organizers, for example, targeted and intimidated by police visits and isolated and silenced by restrictive bail conditions. Those who actually had our leaflets giving them background on their rights were singled out for arrest. And our conclusion is that we need answers to these unanswered questions. A public inquiry with subpoena powers is the best way to go forward with that. And it's the citizens of Canada, it's the people who live in Canada who are seeing our hard-won rights and freedoms undermined by the conduct of the police that week that really suffer when those answers aren't addressed in public forum.
Thank you, Mr. Leopold. We'll go to the first round, Mr. Kanya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you please let me know when I have 1 minute left?
Well, yeah, or by a clock.
Thank you. Madam Joubert, I have your paper here, G8 and G20 Summit Costs, July 5, 2010, and I'm looking at page 3, the breakdown of the various countries and the expenses. Can you explain, first of all, what the major differences were between the expenses in Canada in relation to other countries, why they were so much different, and what the main differences were, within the context of you already indicating today that this was one of the most expensive summits in history?
Yes, thank you. There's a variety of different factors that come into play why some expenses are why some summits are more expensive than others. For example, if a country host picks picks a facility that they already have a structure in place where they can host a meeting, for example, then they won't have to spend money on erecting a certain facility. Broadband communications have to take into account how they're going to actually transport the leaders. So, for example, say if you had a summit in Toronto versus having it in Muskoka, you'd be able to avoid the additional costs that would have to be taken in to get the leaders from Toronto to Muskoka. Most would fly directly into here. There are other factors that come into assessing a location, for example, security. Since 9/11 and 2000, in particular, there have been efforts to have G8 summits at more remote locations because they're seen as more securable and harder to get to in terms of demonstrators. So again, these are the costs, the sort of costs that come into consideration. One of the major reasons why Canada tends to have to spend so much more money on security is because we don't have major structures or major annual portions of our budget that are, say, awarded to military structures. So, for example, when the Washington Summit was held in 2008, they already had so much security infrastructure in place just because of the everyday ongoings of Washington that they didn't need to usher in special summit dollars for such a security measure. So these are all the types of things that come into play. I'm happy to answer more specific questions, but I hope that gives you a bit of a...
My understanding is that the government spent more than $200 million extra because they split the summit between Huntsville and Toronto. Is that an accurate figure? Do you have an exact figure of how much extra they spent?
I can't give you a specific dollar figure, but certainly it would have been less if they would have had both of the summits in Toronto, because you would have been able to combine all of the facilities. You would have been able to, not have the extra security measures that were needed in the second location.
And based on your analysis historically of all these other summits, was there any reason why they could not have combined the G8 and the G20 summits only in Toronto?
In technical terms, no. There is no reason why they couldn't have done it. There are a variety of other reasons why they may have stuck the way it was.
Political decisions?
Yes.
Right. Okay, Mr. Leetold, in terms of your report here, on page 1, starting page 1 and then going to the last page, you have a quote here which I will say as a Canadian I find disturbing, but I'm going to read it. The rampant violations of civil, political, and human rights by police and security during the G20 summit represents not a misstep by police in how they handle large protests, but a systematic targeting of social movements on the left and a deliberate repression of those who criticize and oppose the policies of this government. I take it you mean the Harper government when you say this government?
Well, yes, in particular, we've identified the Harper government, but having said that...
Let me just read the other quote as well.
Certainly.
Page 10. The G20 policing and resulting civil, political, and human rights violations was not a random blip in our country's otherwise solid record of respecting the rights of its citizens and residents. It was, in fact, the most obvious and recent example of a long tradition of state interference against social justice critics of government policies, and as you say, a, quote, pattern that seems to have become even more pronounced with the current Harper Conservative government. So I'd like you to more fully explain what you mean about how our civil liberties are being targeted and this pattern by the Harper Conservatives.
Certainly. Well, looking into recent history, there has been much criticism of the mass arrests that took place in Quebec in 2001 during the Free Trade Area of the Americas protests. And that certainly that pattern of mass arrests is exactly what we're seeing fleshed out and even on steroids, as it were, the weekend of the G20. This is the largest mass arrest in Canadian history. Over 1,000 people are held, and at least 740 of those without charge. And as we've seen many of the charges crumble in court as they've attended and had them withdrawn, as the media has reported. So our group's perspective, we're seeing, as I've indicated in the report, or as we've indicated in the report, a pattern of targeting of social justice activists In essence, because what we're saying is the policing and the pattern of policing, which involved surveillance at the beginning, harassment of activists leading up to illegal detention and arrest, is one that we've seen before, such as around the free trade area of the Americas, but essentially beefed up and on steroids with respect to what we saw at the G20. And those conclusions that we've drawn, I think, are rational under the circumstances and what we've seen and what our on-the-ground observations were.
Thank you. Superintendent Adams, from a policing perspective, was there any reason why the G8 and G20 summits could not have both taken place in Toronto?
Sir, a decision of that magnitude isn't made by the policing partners. So that's a government decision. That wasn't a decision that they certainly didn't ask my opinion on.
No, I understand that. And I understand from as well that the Peel Regional Police Force, which does fine work, had nothing to do with the downtown operations of Toronto in terms of making decisions in the mass arrest. That was all in the City of Toronto Police Department, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Kenya. We'll now move to Madame Morani. Madame Morani, vous avez
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for coming today. I have some questions for you, Mr. Adams. Earlier on, you said that several uniformed officers were sent in as reinforcements for the G20 to help the Toronto police, and that there were some 120 of your uniformed officers who participated. Is that correct?
And we sent down a command team with supervisors and 120 uniformed officers. That's correct.
Est-ce que le dimanche au matin,
On the Sunday morning, did you or your people participate in the arrests? The operation that I would call Operation University of Toronto in the gym. Did you participate in that? Did your uniformed police officers participate in that?
vous n'avez pas participé?
No, we did not.
Très bien. J'aurais
You didn't participate there. Okay. I have another question for you, Mr. Adams. When your officers or investigators intervene in private places, such as a university or a home, if you don't have information that there is danger, and let's take the example of the gym. If you were to intervene in the gym, you'd have to have a warrant.
States, circumstances and information that we have, what evidence we have. So it's sort of a general comment that you're making. It all depends on what my investigations say, what intelligence we have, what evidence we have. So does that help you?
Non, pas vraiment. En fait,
Not really. No. My question is simple. If you enter a private place, do you need a warrant or not? Do the police in general need a warrant?
And so if I'll give you an example. If I'm sent to a call where I have a husband and wife involved in a situation where there's violence involved.
non, non.
So
non.
if you're asking. Okay.
Non.
No.
Je voudrais vous préciser.
I'll clarify. Young people, for example, who are in a gymnasium, sleeping. That's a situation. To enter there and arrest everyone, do the police need a warrant?
Say to you is it depends on the evidence and the information that we have. My apologies. That's.
Bon, d'accord. OK. En tout cas, monsieur...
Okay. I hope you know Mr. Blair? The chief?
Ben, monsieur Blair, lui, il dit...
Mr. Blair said that a warrant would have been required, but that he didn't have one. That's what Mr. Blair said on November 3rd. No, let me see it. Yes, November 3rd. So Mr. Blair stated that the people who were arrested in that gym, in response to my question, and why did all the charges fall? Why were they all dismissed? And what he told us was that the courts determined that the agents said the officers didn't have a warrant.
I don't believe that's exactly what Chief Blair said. I think there was discussion about it, and I think that if you were to go back to the record, that's not exactly what he said. I know that Ms. Morani has said that in the past, but I don't think he said that a warrant would have been requested. They had the grounds to go in. Okay. I think they're...
Madam Morani, I do admit that you did not use a quote, so you were maybe, you were maybe you'd want to clarify a little more. You may want to clarify a little more.
Je vais être très clair, là. Je sais lire.
I'll be very clear. I know how to read. November 3. The Crown and the courts decided that the circumstances surrounding the arrest required what we call a fini warrant. That's what he said. And that the police did not have the necessary warrant. I know how to read. That's what it says here in black and white. So here's my question, and I hope you're going to be answering. So Mr. Blair said that he didn't have the necessary warrant, and that the arrests, and these are my remarks, that these arrests were illegal. And those are my words. Is a fini warrant something that's new? Is it new for the police? Or is it something that you use quite regularly? Is the police aware that they need a warrant to enter into places? Don't you find this a bit odd? Into dwellings? I find that quite surprising.
Write that down. The first bit, is the Feeney process new? No, it's not. But you're asking me to comment on a Toronto investigation, a Toronto operation. I don't have all those facts. So you want me to give you a simple answer. Unless I have all that information in front of me, I can't give you a truthful answer. So I apologize, but the information you give me, that's a Toronto investigation.
D'accord. Right? Monsieur Leitold.
Okay. Mr. Leitold, what do you think about that? The comments made by Commissioner Blair, that if all the charges were dropped, it's because they didn't have the warrant that they required in order to enter that facility.
The Defense Committee has concluded that people's rights have been trampled upon wantonly by the security forces, both in the weeks leading up and during the weekend of the G20. We would, I think, opine that this is simply one more example of that pattern of disregard of the charter protections that people expect in this country, and we're deeply concerned by that. And I think everyone should be. And it's exactly for those reasons that I think we need to get to the bottom of who gave those types of orders, who made those tactical and operational decisions. And I think a public inquiry is the best forum for that to be elucidated.
Donc, ce que je comprends, vous êtes pour une...
So what I understand is that you're in favor of a public inquiry. The minister appeared before our committee, and I put the question regarding an inquiry to him, but it didn't seem to be his priority. He didn't at all say that he would conduct it, nor would he apologize to people whose charges were dropped after that date. Now, people came to see me. They said that there were people provoking others in the crowd. And if I remember correctly, I put the question to Commissioner Blair and the person accompanying him. I don't have his name here, but he said no. There weren't any provokers there. Based on the information that you have, are these allegations of... Were there people there to provoke the groups?
Over. We'll move to Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leitold, you're a lawyer, and you seem to have, in your brief, covered very comprehensively a number of what you say are the rights that were violated. What is your understanding of the right of a Canadian citizen to be informed of the charges against them after being arrested? When must that happen?
Well, it's not only a citizen of Canada, it's anyone in Canada. The Charter would apply. Section 10A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms would indicate that that one is to be advised of the reasons of one's detention or arrest essentially immediately upon that transpiring. There's a line of cases that would support that. It's distinct in effect from the right to counsel, which is to be provided without delay. The right to know the reasons for one's detention or arrest is framed positively and should happen almost instantaneously upon that crystallizing.
Okay, well, you anticipated my next question, which is, under Canadian law, what's your understanding of when a Canadian citizen who's arrested must be given the right to access counsel? And I think you've answered that without delay.
That's correct.
You had some 25 legal advisors, I presume lawyers, that were retained during the course of the G20 process. I just wanted to know, did you hear reports of people who had either of those or both of those rights offended? And if so, can you give us an idea of what the extent of that violation was?
Well, as we detail in our submission to this committee, in fact, what we are concerned about is what appeared to be a systemic violation of both 10A and 10B rights under the Charter. Just to clarify, again, those rights apply to anyone regardless of citizenship who's in Canada, but further, with respect to the issue of retaining counsel, we actually hadn't retained counsel. We'd received volunteer commitments from people to act in bail hearing settings. In any event, what we saw was people who were held at the Prisoner Processing Centre were not able to contact counsel for in some cases not at all, and in some cases there were extensive delays. And these were reported by the people who were responding to phone calls. The ones that did come in, people were saying, I've been held in excess of a day in some cases, and others who never really knew why they were detained or arrested. Okay. People who, Francophones especially, who were being released saying, I never really understood what's happened for the last 36, 48 hours.
Okay.
And to me, and I think to everyone living in Canada, that should be shocking.
Now, I want to turn to you, Mr. Adams. You're an experienced police officer. What is your understanding, and what are your officers in the Peel Regional Police Force, what are they told about their obligation after arresting someone to inform them of the reasons for arrest? When would a Peel Regional Officer, what would his training tell him or her they need to make that information known to the person they're arresting?
Sir, I believe he articulated that perfectly. Our officers are taught that right at the Ontario Police College from day one of their training. Okay.
And similarly, your officers would also be told that they had to inform someone upon arrest that they had the right to retain and instruct counsel without undue delay. Is that what your officers would tell someone? Sir, you're probably aware that there were dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds, I'm not sure of the number, of people who alleged during the G20 process that they were arrested, not told the reasons why they were arrested, and were not told that they had a right to contact a lawyer for some time. Did you hear those allegations as well, sir?
Via what I've heard in regards to this committee and the media, yes.
Okay. Have there been any complaints that any of your officers may have violated those rights, allegations that they had?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Sir, Mr. Adams, on what grounds is it your understanding that police officers are legally entitled to stop, question, and search an individual in a public place?
Our officers understand, as far as an individual's rights, they're well aware what their rights are under the Charter. Mm-hmm. And our officers, once again, sort of train that right from the first day of Ontario Police College.
So you'd agree with me that officers do not have an unconditional right to stop someone in a public place?
No, sir.
Detain them? Okay. Now, you heard the question from Mr. Leetold. I want to pose that question to you on his behalf. What were frontline officers told at the Peel Regional officers of the legal limits of their powers to stop and search people in the G20?
That didn't change from what their normal daily duties were, sir.
Okay. And I presume they would have been instructed that they can only stop and detain someone and search them if they have lawful or reasonable grounds, whatever those may be under
That's part of their training, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Mr. Leetold, you also stated, I think, that protesters who were targeted simply for having legal support phone numbers on their person. Is that correct?
That's reports that we've received. Our submission to this committee is a synthesis of legal observer reports and reports received by members of our committee.
Okay. Back to you, Mr. Adams. Does the Peel Regional Police engage in any activities to educate the public about their rights and responsibilities when dealing with law enforcement individuals?
Do we educate?
Do you have any activities that sort of educate the public community at large about that?
As far as educating the public, as far as the G20, we had a community relations group in relation to the summits, but as far as what their rights are,
that wouldn't be part of what
program, you do. Not as a general program, no. When we deal with them, they're dealt with professionally and with courteous, and as far as their rights. And
Okay. Now, you would agree with me that simply possessing a document that just outlines your constitutional rights or your legal rights would not be a ground upon which a police officer would make any negative assumption or arrest that person. Would you agree with me?
Can you reword that for a second?
Yeah, a person just simply having a constitutional document on them that says know their rights card would not be a reason for any officer in your detachment to make any negative assumption about that person, would it?
No, sir.
Okay. By the way, is it a requirement of your force, sir, that Peel Regional Police officers are required to display their name and badge numbers when they're dealing with the public?
With our organizations, it's your epaulets, so you find up here on your shoulders, and they have to have their epaulets on their most outer gear. So in the wintertime, it'd be on your winter parka. In the summertime, if you're just wearing a shirt, it'd be on your shirt.
And that's name and badge number?
That's just your badge number.
Okay. And,
as a senior officer, we have name tags, but our constables have their badge number.
and I take it, would it be a violation of your department policy if an officer were to cover that up when they're out dealing with the public?
Yes, it is. Procedure policies clearly indicate you do wear your epaulets.
That would be improper? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just explore quickly the concept of preventative arrest, Mr. Adams. A lot of people, it seems, were arrested by police not for what they've done, not even for any evidentiary basis, but as a preventative measure for what a mere suspicion was that they might do. Do you have any comment to this committee about that practice by police? Is it something your officers endorse?
Are we talking about the breach of the peace?
Preventive arrest.
If we're talking about the breach of the peace?
Would you agree with me there would have to be an evidentiary basis before such an arrest would be made?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. We'll now proceed to the government side. Mr. McKenzie.
Chair, and thank you to the panel for being here. Superintendent, my friend asked about the breach of the peace, and it's a reasonable probable grounds to believe it's about to occur.
That's right.
So it's a little bit different. The other thing my friend said, and it's something we rarely hear around here, and I thank him for it because it is, I think, important. He said about someone with something on their person, the rights and freedoms and so on, but he also said about responsibilities. Somehow, we never hear anybody talk about the responsibilities that people have for this. It's always the responsibility of the state for everything else, but sometimes I think the average citizen out there wonder what kind of responsibilities. There's nothing in the charter that talks to responsibilities that I know of. Do you know of anything in it?
Off the top of my head, sir, no. Brigadier General Collins, there's been different costs associated with the summits, and one of the things was glow sticks, and some other people made fun of the glow sticks. Can you tell us? My understanding was it was the military that used glow sticks.
It was the military that used glow sticks, yes. I will preface my remarks by just re-emphasizing that we were very cautious on the monies we spent, and we came in well under budget, partly because of the cautious approach, the frugal approach, if you will, that we took. Specifically with glow sticks. Glow sticks are a non-electric, low-level light source. We all know what glow sticks are. A lot of kids use them on Halloween, etc. That's clearly not what we use them for. The fact that they are non-electric means that they can be used in any environment, including close to flammables and explosives. And the fact that they are not electric is they are more reliable. Batteries don't run out, flashlights don't break. We use glow sticks primarily for safety reasons. They mark fence lines. They mark trenches if we are in combat operations. They'll mark wires. They'll mark all sorts of hazards. They'll mark trails for us for night operations. In domestic operations, all of that you can appreciate becomes even more important because we were in and among the community. And even though we may be in a wooded area that was dark, the chances of a community member coming into that area is quite high. We did not wish them walking into fence lines or tripping over wires or walking into our tents or even worse, driving into our tents. And therefore, we use glow sticks for safety, for illumination purposes at nighttime.
Thank you. Ms. Goubert, I think appreciate your studies worldwide. Have you done any studies where G8 and G20 were held back-to-back in any country?
No, this was the first time that ever happened, and it doesn't seem like it's going to happen again. The French, who are the next to host both summits, will be holding separate summits. The G8 will happen in the summertime, and then the following G20 will be in November.
So there is some cost involved in running two summits back to back. Fair enough.
Yes.
When you talk about other locations, and we've seen different numbers, there's certainly a sense that other numbers don't compare to ours for a variety of reasons. Fair to say that London, England, Police Department is several thousand larger numbers of personnel than we have in any municipality in Canada?
Yes, from my knowledge.
And fair to say that London has been a center that has faced numerous protests, violent, some not so violent, but the community is actually, in many respects, has been hardened. They've got more video equipment, more thicker glass in their stores, all of those things that Canada is not used to having.
I can't answer that 100%, but I would guess that they have spent more money on those types of measures just because of past experiences such as terrorist attacks and such that have been experienced in London.
Okay, and now we've seen and heard from some other communities by the press that they've spent a few $1 million in some of these summits. Is it accurate to say that that's their total cost, or that's the cost for some smaller part of the security for a summit?
It varies from country to country in terms of what we see. So, for example, there was figures at the Pittsburgh summit that were around $18 million. That was largely for additional services that were needed. If you tallied up all of the security services, for example, that were needed for that summit, it was probably around $90 million. So that would be the total summit costs in terms of security. So certainly there's a reason why I alluded to that earlier, why Canada has to spend more money in terms of security. I think in terms of an outlier for these summits was the question of why the figure was so much higher and whether or not it needed to be. In terms of the studies we've done, it seemed higher than other summits in terms of countries that are more comparable to Canada, but certainly there's a reason why the numbers are significantly lower in particular countries.
I think you indicated Japan may have been the most expensive?
It was the most expensive summit at the G8 in 2000, yes, about $750 million, and that was just for a G8 summit.
That was for G8, and that's not significantly less in the big picture to where our numbers are currently in Canada for two summits.
Yes, but the Japanese summit, more of the money was spent on infrastructure than security. So in terms of the 2000 summit, less money was spent on security than the Canadian summits. The overall figure, however, was higher because of the infrastructure that was put into that particular area.
Is it fair to say it's very difficult to compare apples and oranges in these summits because different countries have different situations?
Yes, it's extremely excruciating exercise, and at the end of the day, I would say that the figures that we come out with, it offers a snippet in terms of trying to compare each one, but they're never going to be exact.
Sure, and I think that's what everybody has to realize is that the situations are not the same in every country we go to. Is that fair?
I would say that's fair, yes.
Okay.
Well, you got 5 seconds left.
I just wanted to mention to Mr. Leopold, I think you gave us credit for being in power in 2001, and it wasn't the Harper Conservatives.
No, I wasn't.
Thank you.
I didn't
Thank
say
you.
that.
Mr. Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I could also to Ms. Guibert, I think what I'm hearing you say, this was a meeting that was supposed to be about austerity, about tackling international debt. If the government, I guess, put its austerity hat on, if its priority was reducing costs, looking at other experiences with other jurisdictions, looking at the possibility of hosting both summits in one location instead of spreading it out at two, in your opinion, would it have been possible to do this for a lot less money?
I think that there are ways that less money could have been spent, particularly hosting the summit in one location would have been one way to do that. And there, I think, are a variety of other ways that costs could have been cut that were made at this summit.
Right, and I noticed that Mr. McKenzie didn't mention as an example the security benefits of $85,000 of snacks at one hotel, or the security benefits of fake lakes and other such expenses. But to Mr. Leopold, if I could, I'm wondering, you've called for a federal inquiry. We know that the Toronto Police Board has said that there's a need for looking at this from a federal perspective. In your opinion, what would the context of that be? What would be the scope of it, if you will? And secondly, I'm wondering if you could maybe, as an example, we don't have a lot of time, give an example of a group that has been highly critical of the government that faced the type of treatment that you're referring to.
Thank you, Mr. Holland. The bells are now sounding, the bells are ringing, and the lights are flashing, and so we want to thank you for attending. That brings the meeting to the end. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your input on this study that this committee is conducting, and if you would like to submit any more information to our committee, we would appreciate that. We are adjourned.